My coworker built her career by ruining everyone else's. Then the one anonymous confession blew her world apart in seconds. My coworker Meredith had this whole routine where she'd position herself as everyone's supportive work friend, while systematically destroying their careers behind their backs. She'd show up early every morning with coffee for everyone and ask, "How are you really doing?" in this concerned voice, like she genuinely cared about our well-being. People would open up to her about their stress or personal problems, and she'd nod sympathetically, saying, "This job can be so overwhelming, you're so brave for sharing that with me." Then she'd go straight to our manager, Craig, and express concerns about their mental stability and ability to handle their workload. She was incredibly calculated about it. When Jerome mentioned his divorce was affecting his sleep, Meredith told Craig that Jerome seemed unstable and might need to be removed from the Henderson project for everyone's safety. When Alicia said she was struggling with anxiety about a presentation, Meredith suggested to Craig that Alicia clearly couldn't handle high-pressure situations and shouldn't be considered for the promotion. She'd frame it all as caring too much and wanting to protect the team from someone who might crack under pressure. The genius part was how she'd comfort the person afterward when they got removed from projects or passed over for opportunities. She'd bring them tea and say, "Management just doesn't understand how talented you are, but I see you and I'm here for you." People thought she was their only ally when she was literally the one destroying them. She kept a notebook where she'd write down everyone's personal information during their heart-to-heart conversations. She called it her caring journal, but it was really opposition research. She knew whose kid was struggling in school, whose parent was sick, whose marriage was failing, and she'd weaponize all of it. She'd tell Craig that someone requesting time off for their sick mother was probably lying because they seemed fine yesterday. She'd mention that someone's kid's behavioral issues were probably causing too much distraction for them to focus on work. This went on for 2 years, and Meredith got 3 promotions while everyone around her got demoted, transferred, or fired. She'd give these tearful speeches at farewell parties about how much she'd miss working with such wonderful people while knowing she'd orchestrated their departure. Management thought she was the most stable, reliable employee because she never seemed to have any problems of her own. She'd created this image of being the office rock who everyone relied on while she was actually the office cancer metastasizing through every department. People started noticing patterns but couldn't prove anything because Meredith was so careful. She never put anything in writing and always framed her sabotage as concern. Whenever someone confronted her, she'd cry and say she was just trying to help, and maybe she cared too much, but that's just who she was. She'd make the person feel guilty for questioning her motives, then use that interaction to tell Craig they were showing signs of paranoia and aggression. The whole thing unraveled during the annual company retreat. Meredith had been working on her biggest sabotage yet, trying to get our entire department restructured so she could become department head. She'd been telling Craig that everyone was burned out and incompetent, and the only solution was to bring in fresh blood under her leadership. At the retreat, there was a team-building exercise where we had to share our biggest workplace challenges anonymously through an app, and then discuss solutions as a group. The responses would show up on a big screen for everyone to see. Meredith was facilitating because, of course, she'd volunteered to run the supportive sharing circle. The first few responses were normal stuff about workload and communication, but then something weird happened. A response popped up that said, "My biggest challenge is Meredith telling Craig I'm mentally unstable, because I mentioned my divorce." Another one immediately followed saying Meredith reported me as incompetent after I confided about my anxiety. Then they started flooding in. Meredith got me removed from the Johnson account after I told her about my mother's cancer. Meredith said I was too emotional to lead after I cried in her office about my miscarriage. Meredith used my kid's autism diagnosis to question my focus during my review. The screen was filling up faster than anyone could read. 20 different people describing how Meredith had betrayed their trust and destroyed their careers. The room was completely silent except for the notification sounds of more responses coming in. Meredith tried to laugh it off, saying this was obviously some kind of technical glitch or someone's idea of a cruel joke, but then Craig stood up. He said, "Actually, Meredith, I need to share something too." He pulled out his phone and started reading from his notes. And Meredith was horrified and screamed, "Stop!" Craig didn't even flinch when Meredith screamed at him. He just kept his phone up and started reading in this calm, steady voice that somehow made everything feel more real. He said on March 15th, Meredith told me Jerome was showing signs of instability after his divorce and recommended removing him from the Henderson project for team safety. He scrolled and kept going. April 2nd. Meredith expressed concerns that Alicia's anxiety made her unsuitable for high-pressure situations and suggested she not be considered for the senior role. His voice never changed as he listed date after date with exact quotes from their conversations. The room was so quiet I could hear someone's watch ticking from 3 seats away. Craig explained he'd started documenting everything 3 months ago when he noticed a pattern in Meredith's reports. He said every single concern she brought to him targeted someone right after they'd confided something personal to her. He'd been tracking it and waiting to see if he was wrong or if his suspicions were actually true. Nobody moved while he talked. Meredith tried to stand up and head for the door, but the retreat facilitator stepped in front of it and said in this surprisingly firm voice that everyone needed to stay until the session concluded properly. Meredith's face went from red to white and she sat back down hard in her chair. Jerome suddenly stood up and his whole body was shaking. He asked Craig why he waited 3 months if he knew what was happening to all of us. His voice cracked when he said 3 months while we all suffered and thought we were failures. Craig looked down at his phone and then back at Jerome. He admitted he was scared of being wrong and ruining someone's career based just on suspicion. He said he kept second-guessing himself, thinking maybe he was the one being paranoid until watching the confessions flood in just now confirmed his worst fears were actually true. Alicia started crying and said she almost quit last month because she genuinely believed she was incompetent like Meredith had told Craig. She wiped her eyes and said she'd been questioning her own abilities and wondering if she was having a breakdown. Several other people around the room were nodding and a few started crying too. Someone said they'd been in therapy for 6 months trying to fix problems that weren't even real. Another person said they'd started taking medication because they thought something was wrong with them. The weight of realizing we'd all been blaming ourselves for Meredith's calculated sabotage hit the room like something physical. Meredith finally spoke up, and her voice was breaking in that way she always did when she wanted sympathy. She insisted she was genuinely trying to help, and everyone was misunderstanding her intentions. She said she has anxiety and sometimes overreacts to things because she cares so much about everyone. She made it sound like she was the victim of her own caring nature, and we were all being cruel to someone who just wanted to protect the team. A few people actually looked uncertain for a second because she was that good at the performance. I felt something click in my brain and suddenly I was standing up. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and held it up so everyone could see the screen. I explained I'd taken a screenshot months ago of Meredith's notebook sitting open on her desk when she'd stepped away. The page showed my name with notes about my mother's dementia and my financial stress. Everything was labeled with stars and underlines like she was doing research for a project. I zoomed in so people could read the actual words and someone gasped. Other people started pulling out their phones and suddenly everyone was sharing evidence they'd been too scared to report before. One guy had a recording of Meredith asking detailed questions about his marriage problems while pretending to offer support. A woman showed text messages where Meredith had pumped her for information about her kid's learning disability. Someone else had emails that proved Meredith knew certain personal details she'd later claimed were affecting work performance. The evidence just kept coming, and Meredith's face showed she knew she was done. The retreat facilitator looked completely overwhelmed by everything unfolding. She pulled out her phone and called the company's emergency HR line with trembling fingers. She explained the situation in this quiet, urgent voice, while we all sat there surrounded by proof of 2 years of systematic manipulation. Fiorella Corona from HR showed up exactly 20 minutes later with 2 other officials I didn't recognize. They spoke briefly with the facilitator, then walked straight to Meredith. Fiorella said they needed to move to a separate room for immediate questioning. Meredith tried to argue, but one of the other officials just gestured toward the door in a way that made it clear this wasn't optional. They left, and the room felt different the second the door closed behind them. The rest of us just sat there in this weird atmosphere that mixed shock with relief with anger all together. People started hugging and crying, but there was also this uncomfortable awareness settling over everyone. We'd all suffered completely alone when we could have helped each other if we'd just spoken up sooner. Someone said they'd suspected something was off, but convinced themselves they were being paranoid. Another person admitted they'd noticed Meredith's pattern, but were too scared to say anything in case they were wrong. The collective guilt of our silence sat heavy, even though we knew Meredith was the one who'd created the environment where we couldn't trust each other. Craig stood up again and addressed the whole group. He said he needed to take full responsibility for enabling Meredith by accepting her reports without proper investigation. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. He explained he'd failed us as a manager by not questioning the pattern, or protecting us from someone who was weaponizing his trust. He said he was prepared to face whatever consequences the company decided, including demotion or termination, because he'd let this go on for 2 years. Some people nodded while others looked away, and I realized we were all processing different levels of anger at different targets, including ourselves. Fiorella walked back into the room about 15 minutes later with a tablet in her hands, and this expression that tried to look reassuring, but came across more like she was reading from a crisis management script. She stood at the front where Meredith had been facilitating and cleared her throat to get everyone's attention. She explained that after reviewing the situation with her team and company leadership, they were suspending Meredith immediately pending a full investigation into workplace conduct violations. Her voice had this careful corporate quality, where every word seemed were chosen by a legal department. She said the company takes these allegations very seriously and wants to ensure a thorough and fair process for everyone involved. Someone in the back made a noise that sounded like disbelief, and Fiorella's face tightened slightly, but she kept going. She asked everyone who had submitted anonymous confessions or had experiences with Meredith to write detailed formal statements describing what happened, when it happened, and any evidence they might have. She pulled up a form on her tablet and said we could access it through our work emails and should submit everything within the next 48 hours. A woman near me raised her hand and asked if our statements would actually lead to any real consequences, or if this was just the company covering itself legally. Fiorella paused and gave this response about how the investigation would be conducted by an independent third party, and all findings would be reviewed by senior leadership to determine appropriate action. The corporate speak made several people shift in their seats uncomfortably, because it sounded more like protection for the company than justice for us. We spent the rest of that day at the retreat center, sitting in different conference rooms, writing out statements instead of doing the team-building exercises that were supposed to bring us closer together. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that an activity meant to build trust had actually exposed the person who'd been destroying it systematically for 2 years. I sat at a table with my laptop trying to figure out how to put everything into words that would make sense to someone who hadn't lived through it. How do you explain that someone bringing you coffee every morning was actually gathering intelligence to use against you? I wrote about the time I mentioned my mother's dementia diagnosis, and 3 days later got pulled into a meeting where Craig questioned whether I could handle my current workload given my family stress. I included the screenshot of Meredith's notebook page with my name and personal details. I described how she'd comforted me afterward, saying management didn't understand caregivers, and she was there if I needed support. Writing it all down made the pattern so obvious that I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. Around me, other people were doing the same thing, typing or writing by hand, some of them crying while they documented their experiences. The retreat facilitator kept bringing in coffee and snacks like that would somehow make up for the fact that her team-building exercise had blown up everyone's professional lives. That evening back at the hotel, several of us ended up gathering in Jerome's room because nobody wanted to be alone with their thoughts. We ordered pizza and sat around on the beds and chairs just talking for hours about what Meredith had done to each of us. Laying everything out together made the pattern even clearer than it had been on the screen during the exercise. One person would share their story, and someone else would say, "Oh my God, she did almost the exact same thing to me." She'd used the caring journal approach on at least 15 people we could identify just in that room. She'd weaponized information about sick parents, struggling kids, mental health issues, relationship problems, financial stress. Every vulnerability anyone had trusted her with got turned into a reason they couldn't do their job properly. Someone pointed out that she never targeted people who were already struggling professionally, because that would be too obvious. She went after people who were doing well and used their personal challenges to create doubt about their stability. It was calculated in a way that made my skin crawl, because you could see the strategy behind every move she'd made. Jerome sat on the edge of the bed and told us that after Meredith got him removed from the Henderson project, he started seeing a therapist twice a week, because he genuinely thought he was having some kind of breakdown. He'd mentioned his divorce affecting his sleep during one conversation with Meredith, and suddenly he was characterized as unstable and potentially dangerous to work with. He spent thousands of dollars on therapy trying to fix problems that were actually caused by deliberate sabotage rather than mental illness. His voice cracked when he said he'd been blaming himself for failing professionally, when really he'd been targeted by someone who knew exactly how to exploit his vulnerability. The therapist had helped him work through the divorce grief, but couldn't fix the career damage because the therapist didn't know the real source of the problem was Meredith poisoning his professional reputation. Alicia was sitting in the desk chair, and she admitted she'd started taking anxiety medication 6 months ago, after Meredith's campaign against her escalated. She'd confided about feeling nervous before a big presentation, and that confession got turned into evidence that she couldn't handle high-pressure situations. She kept getting passed over for opportunities, and started believing she was actually as weak and incompetent as Meredith had suggested to Craig. Learning that her anxiety was a reasonable response to calculated manipulation, rather than some personal failure, made her mad in a way I'd never seen from her before. She said she'd been blaming herself for being too sensitive when really she'd been under attack by someone who knew exactly which buttons to push. Her hands were shaking as she talked, and someone reached over to squeeze her shoulder. Someone asked who had set up the anonymous confession system through the team-building app, because it clearly wasn't random or accidental. We all wanted to thank whoever had orchestrated the exposure and given us a way to speak up safely. People started speculating about who might have done it and why they'd chosen that specific moment during the retreat. A few people guessed it might have been someone from IT who'd noticed patterns in Meredith's behavior. Others thought maybe it was someone who'd left the company and wanted to expose what had happened to them. Nobody in the room claimed responsibility that night, and the mystery of who'd set it up hung over the conversation like this weird combination of gratitude and curiosity. The next morning, the company cut the retreat short and sent everyone home. We came down for breakfast and found out Meredith had already been escorted off the property by security before most of us even woke up. The retreat coordinator made an announcement that due to unforeseen circumstances, the remaining activities were canceled, and transportation back to the city would be available starting at 10. It felt both satisfying and anticlimactic because part of me had wanted to see Meredith leave, to have some kind of visible closure. Instead, she just disappeared like she'd never been there, and we were left packing our bags and loading onto buses in this strange, subdued mood. Back at the office on Monday, there was this weird energy where everyone was being extra nice to each other, but also clearly uncomfortable. People would make eye contact and smile, but then look away quickly like they weren't sure what the new rules were for workplace interaction. The empty desk where Meredith used to sit became this focal point that everyone avoided looking at directly. Her computer was gone and her personal items had been cleared out, but you could still see the outline on the desk where her coffee mug usually sat. Walking past that empty space felt like passing a crime scene. Some people would speed up when they got near it, and others would slow down and stare like they were trying to process that she was really gone. Fiorella started scheduling individual meetings with each person who'd been affected by Meredith to document everything formally for the investigation. I went into her office on Tuesday afternoon, and she had this whole system set up with a recording device and a legal pad covered in notes. She asked me to walk through my entire history with Meredith chronologically and describe every interaction I could remember where she'd gathered personal information or made concerning reports about me. During my meeting, she revealed that 12 people had come forward so far with formal complaints, and they were still investigating whether there were others who hadn't reported yet. She said some people had left the company in the past year who might have been driven out by Meredith, and they were trying to track those people down to get their statements too. The scope of the damage kept expanding the more they looked into it. Craig got temporarily reassigned while the company investigated his role in enabling Meredith. An interim manager named Tiago Pace took over our department, and his first official act was calling an all-hands meeting to apologize to the team for what we'd endured under failed leadership. Tiago had this direct way of talking that felt different from Craig's more passive management style. He stood at the front of the conference room and said he'd reviewed the preliminary investigation findings and was horrified by what had been allowed to happen. He promised that moving forward there would be new systems in place to prevent any single person from having that much unchecked influence over people's careers. He asked us to give him a chance to rebuild trust, and said his door would always be open if anyone had concerns about workplace dynamics. 2 days after Tiago's meeting, Fiorella called me into a conference room where she was sitting with another woman in a dark suit, who introduced herself as Moira Frost from the legal department. Moira had a stack of folders in front of her, and she started pulling out documents before I even sat down. She explained that Meredith's lawyer had sent over a response claiming she had extensive documentation proving her concerns about employees were legitimate and based on observable behavior patterns. Moira said they needed to build a counter case for each person Meredith had targeted, and they were starting with me because my work history was the most complete. Fiorella opened her laptop and pulled up my employee file going back 4 years to when I was hired. She asked me to walk through every project I'd worked on and every performance review I'd received, so they could compare it against what Meredith had reported to Craig. We spent the next 3 hours going through spreadsheets and project files and client feedback forms. Moira would read out something Meredith had told Craig about my work, and then Fiorella would pull up the actual documentation showing the opposite. Meredith had reported I missed deadlines on the Carson account, but my project logs showed I delivered 2 days early. She told Craig I couldn't handle client communication, but my feedback scores were consistently in the top 10%. She claimed I made errors that cost the company money, but the financial records showed my projects came in under budget. Every single thing Meredith had said about my incompetence was contradicted by actual evidence sitting right there in the company database. The exhausting part wasn't finding the proof because that was all there in black and white. The exhausting part was having to prove I was good at my job when I thought that was already established through 4 years of solid work. Moira kept apologizing and saying she knew this was difficult, but they needed ironclad documentation for every claim. By the time we finished, my back hurt from sitting and my head hurt from going through years of performance data. Fiorella walked me back to my desk and promised they'd handle the rest of the cases the same way, so everyone would have evidence backing them up. The next morning, Luca from IT sent me an email asking if I could come down to his office in the basement. I'd never been to the IT department before and had to ask someone where to find it. Luca's workspace was crammed with monitors and computer equipment, and he had 3 different screens showing code I couldn't understand. He offered me a chair and explained that he'd been asked to investigate the anonymous confession system from the retreat to figure out who set it up. He needed to know if I was involved in creating or planning the exposure. I told him honestly that I had no idea who orchestrated it, and that I'd been just as shocked as everyone else when those confessions started appearing. He seemed relieved and said he believed me because the technical setup required someone with actual programming knowledge. He showed me on one of his screens how someone had modified the team building app to allow unlimited anonymous submissions instead of the one response per person that was supposed to happen. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing and had planned it carefully. I asked if he could tell who it was, and he said he was close to tracking it down through the login credentials. 2 days later, Luca sent an email to me and several other people asking us to meet in the small conference room on the 3rd floor. When I got there, Jerome and Alicia were already sitting down looking confused about why we'd been called together. Luca came in with another guy I recognized from seeing around the office but had never really talked to. Luca introduced him as Miguel Fernandez, who'd transferred from another department about 6 months ago. Miguel looked nervous as he sat down, and Luca explained that Miguel was the one who created the anonymous confession feature and planned the whole retreat exposure. Miguel started talking quickly, saying he needed to explain before anyone got angry. He said that at his previous location within the company, he'd watched Meredith destroy a colleague's career using the exact same tactics she used on us. When he transferred to our department and saw Meredith doing the supportive friend routine, he recognized the pattern immediately. He spent 6 months documenting everything he observed and waiting for the right opportunity to expose what was happening. He knew that accusing someone of systematic manipulation without solid proof would make him look paranoid, or like he had a personal problem with her. So he waited and collected evidence, and when he heard about the team-building exercise at the retreat, he saw his chance. He modified the app to allow the anonymous confessions and sent messages to people he knew had been targeted, asking them to share their experiences during the exercise. Miguel said he had to be certain before acting, because one wrong move would have let Meredith paint him as the problem instead. We all sat there processing this information, and I felt this weird mix of gratitude and discomfort. Miguel had literally saved our careers by exposing Meredith, but the way he'd done it was so calculated and strategic. He'd been watching us suffer for months while he built his case instead of warning us or trying to help earlier. Jerome asked why he didn't just come to us directly, and Miguel said he needed undeniable public proof, or Meredith would have turned it around on him like she did with everyone else. Alicia pointed out that his approach worked when nothing else had, so maybe being strategic was necessary when fighting someone who was that manipulative. We thanked Miguel for what he did, but I left that meeting feeling unsettled about how fighting manipulation sometimes requires being manipulative yourself, even for good reasons. The whole thing made me think about how much planning and calculation it takes to expose someone who's that good at hiding their actions. The next week, Fiorella called another meeting to update us on how the investigation was expanding. She'd been going through Meredith's employment history and found that she'd worked at another company in the same industry before joining ours. Fiorella contacted their HR department and discovered that Meredith had pulled similar tactics there with at least 3 employees before the company quietly let her resign, instead of dealing with the situation properly. They'd given her a neutral reference and let her leave without any formal disciplinary action on her record, which meant she could just move to another company and start the whole pattern over. Fiorella looked angry as she explained this because it meant our company had no way of knowing what Meredith had done before. The previous employer had essentially passed the problem along rather than addressing it and protecting future workplaces from her behavior. That same afternoon, I got an email from someone named Piper Bright, who said she used to work in our department. She'd heard through former colleagues that there was an investigation into Meredith, and she wanted to share her experience. We set up a video call, and Piper explained that she'd left the company 8 months ago after Meredith convinced Craig that Piper was stealing clients and passing information to competitors. None of it was true, but Craig had believed Meredith's reports, and Piper's reputation got damaged, so badly that she had to take a job at a smaller firm making significantly less money. She'd been trying to rebuild her career ever since while dealing with the professional damage from accusations that were completely made up. Piper said she was relieved to finally understand that she hadn't done anything wrong, and that other people had gone through the same thing. Fiorella brought Piper's case to the executive team, and they decided to offer her old position back with back pay for the 8 months she'd lost. When Fiorella called to tell her, Piper said she wasn't sure she could trust working here again after what happened. She needed time to think about whether she wanted to return to a place that had let someone destroy her career without proper investigation. Her hesitation hit me hard because I started wondering the same thing about whether I wanted to stay, even though Meredith was gone. Several other people admitted they were questioning if the company had really changed enough to prevent something like this from happening again. 3 weeks after the retreat, the company officially terminated Meredith for violation of workplace conduct policies and breach of trust. Moira called me to explain that they'd wanted to pursue stronger legal action, but proving intentional sabotage in court would be extremely difficult and expensive. The evidence showed a clear pattern of behavior, but Meredith's lawyer could argue she genuinely believed her concerns were valid, even if they turned out to be wrong. Corporate law made it hard to prove malicious intent versus poor judgment, so the company decided termination with cause was the strongest action they could take that would actually stick. Moira said Meredith wouldn't be able to use them as a reference, and they'd be honest with any future employer who called to verify her employment. It felt like justice, but also like she was getting away with something since she could potentially just move to another company and do it all over again. A week later, Moira called me into her office and showed me a letter from Meredith's lawyer threatening to sue the company for wrongful termination and defamation. The letter was full of legal language about how the investigation was biased, and the evidence was circumstantial, and Meredith's reputation had been destroyed without proper due process. Moira explained that this was a standard intimidation tactic, and the company had solid documentation to defend the decision, including Craig's notes and all our written statements and the recordings from the retreat. She seemed confident, but I could tell she was being careful with her words, like there was still some risk involved. The threat made everyone nervous, even though Moira kept saying it would probably go nowhere. We'd all been feeling like maybe we could finally move forward, and then this letter arrived reminding us that Meredith wasn't just going to disappear quietly. 2 days after that, the company brought in a therapist to offer free counseling sessions for anyone affected by Meredith's actions. I signed up thinking I'd just vent about how angry I was, and maybe get some validation that my feelings were normal. The therapist was this older woman who listened to my whole story without interrupting, and then started asking questions that made me realize how deeply the manipulation had affected my confidence and workplace relationships. She pointed out that I kept minimizing my own achievements and attributing my success to luck or timing rather than skill. She showed me how Meredith's constant undermining had made me question my own judgment about everything from project decisions to whether people actually liked me or were just being polite. I left that first session feeling worse than when I went in, because suddenly I could see all these ways Meredith had gotten into my head that I hadn't even noticed before. Jerome struggled more than most of us because he'd opened up to Meredith about genuinely painful personal issues during his divorce, and having that weaponized felt like a deeper betrayal than just career sabotage. He started missing work, and when he did come in, he looked exhausted, like he wasn't sleeping. Finally, he met with Tiago and asked for a leave of absence to focus on his mental health. The company supported it with full pay, which surprised some of us because we weren't used to seeing that kind of care from management. Jerome sent an email to the team before he left saying he needed time to rebuild his sense of trust in people and in himself, and he appreciated everyone's support. Reading that email made me understand that what Meredith did wasn't just about careers, it was about making people doubt their own reality and worth. While Jerome was gone, Alicia channeled her anger into something productive by advocating for better workplace protections and reporting systems. She drafted this detailed proposal for anonymous reporting channels and mandatory management training on recognizing manipulation patterns and regular check-ins with employees about team dynamics. She spent weeks researching best practices from other companies and talking to HR consultants and putting together this presentation that was honestly impressive. When she presented it to Tiago, he seemed genuinely interested and started asking questions about implementation costs and timeline. Watching Alicia transform her pain into action that could help future employees made me respect her in a completely different way than I had before. About a month after his reassignment, Craig returned with a formal reprimand on his record and mandatory management retraining. Tiago sent an email announcing Craig's return and explaining that he'd completed an intensive program on leadership accountability and recognizing toxic workplace dynamics. Craig started scheduling individual meetings with each of us to apologize personally. When my turn came, he looked uncomfortable and tired, and he admitted he'd been so focused on avoiding conflict and keeping things running smoothly that he'd ignored warning signs he should have investigated. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, but he wanted me to know he was committed to doing better. I accepted his apology because it felt genuine, and because holding on to anger at Craig seemed less important than making sure the whole system changed. Some people were more ready to forgive than others, and that felt fair too. The company started implementing several of Alicia's proposals, including quarterly anonymous surveys about workplace dynamics, and required documentation for any negative performance reports, with evidence and specific examples before any action could be taken. They also created a new reporting system where you could flag concerns about manipulation or toxic behavior without having to identify yourself immediately. It felt like meaningful change, even though some people remained skeptical about whether policies on paper would actually prevent someone like Meredith from operating successfully in the future. There was this tension between wanting to believe things would be different and knowing that systems only work if people actually follow them. 3 weeks after the policy changes, Tiago approached me about taking on the Henderson project that Jerome had been removed from back when Meredith convinced Craig he was unstable. The project was a big deal with a major client, and it would be a significant step up in responsibility and visibility. Part of me wanted to jump at the opportunity because it was exactly the kind of work I'd been hoping to do. But another part felt weird about accepting something that Jerome had lost because of Meredith's lies. I asked Tiago if I could think about it, and then I reached out to Jerome even though he was still on leave. We met for coffee, and I explained the situation and asked how he'd feel about me taking the project. Jerome said he appreciated me asking, but he genuinely wanted me to take it because someone deserving should benefit from the opportunity, even if the circumstances that created it were messed up. He said watching good things happen for people Meredith tried to destroy would actually help him heal. So I accepted the role and threw myself into the work with this weird mixture of excitement and guilt that gradually shifted to just determination to do it well. Miguel became an unexpected friend to a lot of us during this time because he understood what was happening when we couldn't see it clearly. His outsider perspective as someone newer to the team had helped him recognize patterns we were too close to notice. We'd grab lunch and he'd share observations about workplace dynamics that made me think about how isolation enables manipulation. He pointed out that Meredith had been really good at keeping people from talking to each other about their experiences, which prevented us from seeing the pattern until the retreat forced everything into the open. Miguel said at his previous job he'd watched something similar happen, and the key difference was, people there had regular informal conversations, where they'd compare notes about management decisions and team dynamics. It made me realize that protecting against manipulation isn't just about policies, it's about creating genuine connections between coworkers. 4 months after the retreat, Piper decided to return to the company after Tiago personally met with her and walked through all the changes that had been implemented. He showed her the new reporting systems and the training programs, and introduced her to the workplace culture committee that Alicia was leading. Piper came back to the office for a trial week to see how it felt, and people were genuinely happy to see her. Her return felt like a victory for accountability, showing that people who were driven out could reclaim their space, and that the company was serious about making things right. On her 3rd day back, Piper stopped by my desk and thanked me for speaking up at the retreat, because she'd been carrying around shame about being forced out, and finally understanding she hadn't done anything wrong gave her back her confidence. Around that same time, Moira called another meeting to tell us that Meredith's threatened lawsuit never materialized. She explained that Meredith's lawyer had probably advised her the case was too weak to pursue, given all the documentation and witness statements the company had gathered. The legal threat just quietly faded away without any formal withdrawal or settlement. Hearing that removed a weight I didn't fully realize I'd been carrying, because part of me had been worried Meredith would find some way to turn things around and make herself the victim. Knowing she couldn't use the legal system to continue her manipulation brought this sense of relief that spread through the whole team over the next few days. Lawsuit threats never turn into actual legal action when the evidence is that clear against someone. About 2 weeks after that conversation, Alicia mentioned during lunch that she'd started seeing someone she met through the workplace culture committee meetings. She kept it casual, like she wasn't making a big announcement, but I could tell she was testing how it felt to share something personal again after everything with Meredith. The guy worked in facilities management and had joined the committee because he wanted to understand how to make the physical workspace feel safer for people dealing with workplace stress. Alicia said they'd been grabbing coffee after meetings and talking about how hard it was to trust people at work when you'd seen how badly that trust could be broken. Watching her navigate this new relationship with obvious caution but also genuine openness made me think about how recovery doesn't mean going back to how things were before. She was different now, and that wasn't necessarily bad. She asked questions and set boundaries and didn't apologize for protecting herself while still being willing to connect with someone new. It felt like evidence that what Meredith did to us didn't have to be permanent damage. The company sent out another survey about workplace dynamics around the same time, and this one felt different from the usual corporate box-checking exercises. The questions were specific about whether people felt comfortable reporting concerns, and if they trusted management to handle those concerns appropriately. They asked if people felt safe being vulnerable with coworkers, and whether the changes implemented after the retreat had made any real difference. Tiago called a team meeting to share the results, and he had this whole presentation with charts and graphs showing significant improvement in trust levels and reporting comfort across our department. He was careful to say that numbers couldn't capture emotional healing, and that data was limited in what it could tell us about how people actually felt. But he also pointed out that when you ask the same questions 6 months apart, and see measurable positive change that suggests the structural fixes were doing something meaningful, people were reporting feeling more supported and less afraid of retaliation for speaking up. The scores for manager transparency and fairness had jumped significantly. Tiago said these results mattered because they showed we'd built something real after everything fell apart. Fiorella from HR stopped by my desk one afternoon and asked if I'd be willing to share my experience with an incoming group of new hires as part of their workplace culture orientation. She explained they were trying to help new employees understand why the company took these issues seriously and what could happen when toxic patterns went unchecked. At first, the idea made me uncomfortable because talking about what Meredith did still felt like admitting I'd been a victim of something. But then Fiorella pointed out that speaking about it from a position of having survived and helped create change was actually the opposite of victimizing myself. It was using my experience to prevent other people from going through the same thing. I agreed to do it, and when I stood up in front of 20 new employees a week later and told them about the retreat and the confessions and the investigation, I felt surprisingly powerful. They asked good questions about how to recognize manipulation and what to do if they saw concerning patterns. One person asked how I'd rebuilt trust in my own judgment after being fooled by Meredith for so long, and I told them honestly that it was still a work in progress, but that recognizing you were manipulated wasn't the same as being stupid or weak. The whole thing felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Craig finished his management retraining program and came back to lead our team with what seemed like genuine changes in his approach. He started holding weekly one-on-one meetings where he'd ask specific questions about workload and stress levels, and actually write down what people said instead of just nodding along. When someone raised a concern about a coworker, he'd ask for specific examples and documentation, instead of taking reports at face value like he used to do with Meredith. He'd share his thinking process when making decisions about projects or assignments, so people understood why things were happening instead of wondering if there was some hidden agenda. The transparency felt awkward at first because we weren't used to managers explaining themselves, but gradually it started rebuilding trust. People gave him positive feedback during team meetings about feeling more included in decisions, and less worried about being secretly reported for having normal human struggles. Craig still had moments where you could tell he was second-guessing himself because of his past mistakes, but his improved leadership was measurable in how the team functioned. Miguel got offered a promotion to a different department handling data analysis and security protocols. He said the role was perfect for him because it involved identifying patterns and protecting systems, which was basically what he'd done for us with Meredith. We threw him a farewell party in the conference room, and it turned into this unexpected thing where people kept standing up to thank him for his courage in exposing what was happening. Jerome gave this whole speech about how Miguel could have stayed quiet and protected himself, but instead he'd risked his own reputation to document everything and set up the anonymous confession system. Alicia presented him with a card everyone had signed with messages about how his actions had changed their lives. Miguel looked genuinely uncomfortable with all the attention, and kept saying he'd just done what anyone should do when they see something wrong. His leaving felt sad because he'd become such an important part of our healing process, but also right because he deserved opportunities that matched his skills and integrity. Piper and I got assigned to work together on a major client project, updating their supply chain management system. The project was huge and complex, and required the kind of close collaboration where you're constantly bouncing ideas off each other and trusting your partner to handle their pieces without micromanaging. Working with Piper felt like actively reclaiming something Meredith had tried to destroy, because we'd both been targets of her sabotage in different ways. We had this unspoken understanding about what we'd survived that made it easier to be honest about when we were struggling or needed help. The project went incredibly well, and when we presented the final results to the client, they specifically mentioned how seamlessly we'd worked together. Our successful partnership demonstrated that the relationships Meredith damaged could be rebuilt stronger than before, because now they were based on real trust instead of the fake supportiveness she'd offered. The Henderson project that I'd taken over after Jerome was removed from it ended up winning a company innovation award for process improvement. The award ceremony was this fancy thing in the main conference hall with executives giving speeches and department heads presenting trophies. When they called my name, Jerome was sitting in the third row, and he stood up cheering louder than anyone else in the room. Walking up to accept the award, I kept thinking about how Meredith had tried to prevent any of us from succeeding by convincing management we were all incompetent and unstable. The moment felt like collective victory over all her sabotage. During my acceptance speech, I thanked Jerome specifically for his foundational work on the project, and said the innovation built on concepts he'd developed before I took over. After the ceremony, Jerome found me and said watching me succeed with something he'd started felt healing in a way he hadn't expected, because it proved the work itself had value regardless of Meredith's attempts to undermine it. Alicia's workplace culture proposals got adopted company-wide across all departments after our results showed how effective they were. She got invited to present at the next leadership summit where all the executives and senior managers gathered to discuss company direction. I went with a group from our team to watch her presentation, and she was incredible. She walked them through the specific mechanisms that had allowed Meredith's manipulation to flourish, and then showed concrete data about how the new reporting systems and transparency requirements were preventing similar situations. She talked about the cost of toxic workplace culture, not just in employee well-being, but in actual productivity and retention numbers. The executives asked her to join a company-wide task force developing these policies for implementation everywhere. Watching her transform from someone Meredith had targeted for showing vulnerability into a company-wide advocate for workplace safety showed how surviving manipulation could build unexpected strength. A new team member named Sarah joined our department, and something about her reminded me of myself before Meredith. She was eager and open and wanted to be friends with everyone, and I could see her starting to share personal information freely without thinking about how it might be used. I asked her to grab coffee one afternoon, and tried to figure out how to offer guidance about healthy workplace boundaries without making her paranoid or destroying her natural openness. I told her about my own experience in general terms and explained that being cautious about what you share wasn't the same as being closed off or unfriendly. I suggested she take time to observe how people handle information before confiding serious personal stuff, and to notice whether someone's supportiveness led to actual helpful actions or just collecting details. Sarah seemed grateful for the advice and said she'd been sensing something off about how quickly some people wanted to know everything about her life. Finding the balance between caution and openness felt like wisdom, earned through hard experience, and being able to pass that along made the whole terrible situation with Meredith feel slightly less pointless. 8 months after the retreat, Tiago called another team meeting to share performance ratings, and our department had the highest scores in the entire company. He put up the metrics showing project completion rates and client satisfaction and error reduction, and we were leading in every category. Then he talked about how he'd been analyzing what made teams successful, and our numbers correlated directly with the trust levels we'd measured in the workplace surveys. He said the success felt meaningful because it was based on genuine collaboration, rather than anyone's manipulation or sabotage. People were sharing information freely and asking for help when they needed it, and supporting each other through challenges instead of using vulnerabilities as weapons. The authentic trust we'd built after everything fell apart had created an environment where people could actually do their best work without fear. Sitting in that meeting listening to Tiago describe how far we'd come, I felt this unexpected sense of pride in what we'd survived and rebuilt together. A few days after that meeting, Jerome stopped by my desk and asked if we could grab lunch. We went to the sandwich place down the street and sat outside where he told me he needed to say something he'd been thinking about for weeks. He said he was grateful the whole thing with Meredith got exposed when it did, because he'd been really close to quitting and spending the rest of his life thinking he just wasn't good enough at his job. Knowing that his problems came from someone deliberately trying to hurt him instead of his own failures saved his confidence and probably his mental health too. He'd spent months thinking something was wrong with him and questioning every decision he made at work. Finding out it was sabotage felt terrible, but also weirdly freeing because it meant he wasn't actually broken or incompetent like he'd started believing. I told him I understood completely because I'd felt the same way, and we sat there for a while just talking about how weird it was to realize you'd been manipulated so thoroughly. 2 weeks later, I was getting coffee at this shop near my apartment when someone tapped my shoulder. It was a woman I recognized as Meredith's former assistant, though I'd never actually talked to her before. She said she wanted to thank me for speaking up at the retreat, because she'd been watching Meredith's behavior for months and documenting things in her own notes, but was too scared to report anything. She thought nobody would believe her since she was just an assistant and Meredith seemed so well liked by management. Learning that other people saw the same problems and that she wasn't imagining things or being paranoid made her feel less crazy about the whole situation. She'd left the company right after Meredith got fired because the whole environment felt toxic to her, but hearing that things were getting better made her glad she'd stayed quiet long enough to see it exposed properly. A month after that conversation, the company held an all-hands meeting where they announced a bunch of new policies, including an annual award for workplace integrity. They didn't name it after our situation specifically, but Tiago mentioned during his speech that recent events had shown how important it was to recognize people who create genuine supportive environments instead of fake ones. The award would go to someone who demonstrated authentic care for their colleagues and helped build trust within their teams. Sitting in that meeting listening to them describe the award criteria, I felt this weird mix of sadness about what we'd been through and hope that maybe our terrible experience would prevent future problems for other people. 1 year after the retreat, I woke up on a random Tuesday and realized I was actually happy to go to work. Not just okay with it or getting through it, but genuinely looking forward to seeing my colleagues and working on projects together. The office still had normal workplace problems like any job, and probably always would, but people treated each other with real respect instead of using personal information as weapons. I'd learned that speaking up together was way more powerful than suffering alone, and watching Jerome and Alicia and everyone else succeed in an environment free from sabotage made every uncomfortable moment of that exposure worth it.